So hello and welcome. I'm going to talk a little bit about measuring grounds and turf. It's not really specific for turf, it's more general knowledge about measuring the properties of the ground. And we're talking about horses, so it's really no matter what kind of surface they are walking on or working on. So we need to understand some of the basic biomechanics first of all. And the first thing is really understand the immense forces that the horse produces and the surface should withstand. So we are talking about body weight in trot and faster trot, and also in canter. We are 1.5 to 2 times body weight peak vertical load underneath each single hoof, each stride. So a normal horse, we will talk more than 1,000 kilograms or equivalent to that. So it's huge forces we are talking about. It's also important to understand some of the basic biomechanics when it comes to hoof-ground interaction. So first of all, it's very different what happens when the hoof impacts the ground. It's a small mass that hits the ground, but it decelerates. It's a high acceleration when it stops both horizontally and vertical. From a physics point of view, that's very different from the loading phase, which is max load, and here is the tons that I was talking about before. I'm sure you have heard this earlier today, but just this as a very, very quick reminder. And of course, you also have a push-off or a propulsion and push-off phase. I just wanted to remind you of this because this is influencing what we are actually trying to, what properties of the ground we are trying to measure. Another important thing is, of course, general. Do we really know anything about the correlation between orthopedic health or risk of injury and the grounds? It actually has been done some very nice work, especially in thoroughbred racing. So based on a very, very, very simple functional test, and that is measuring going, which usually consists of an elderly gentleman in a caps and a coat, taking his stick, pounding it into the ground and wriggling it back and forth. And then he says, well, the going is good today. So it is a functional test, even though it's very simple. There are some electronic devices that can do this today. The interesting thing is that based on this, comparing these going measurements with the incidence of distal limb fractures. This is done by Tim Parting and other co-authors in several papers. There is a very, very clear correlation between the going when it goes from heavy soft to soft to good to firm, the odds ratio, which means the risk of having a distal limb fracture is increasing significantly. So this is based on literally hundreds of thousands of starts. It's a very, very, very thorough study comprising very, very many horses. And the statistics which this figure actually tells us is also something that you can trust. This is the real world. I have an interesting question for you. So this is for distal limb fracture. I actually have the same data for superficial digital flexor tendon injuries. What do you think happens? Does it look the same, or is it actually the other way around, that it decreases when it gets more firm? Well, many might have seen that it was the opposite way around, but it is still the same. So no matter soft tissue, that is tendon injuries or fractures, they increase with the surface getting more firm. So this is something that is this is very clear. I need to take a short break there. Tjena Rickard. Är det bara något akut? Jag sitter precis i ett möte.
i tråden senare.
Ja, jag ringer dig om en halvtimme.
Ja.
Perfekt, hej.
Hej, hej.
Sorry, I have to erase that part. So this is the background when it comes to injury. Next thing we're going to talk about is the very general physics, of course. It's quite logical that all of these forces we are talking on created by the horses, they should be taken care of by the ground. So and the ground can influence these forces, how they act on the horse. So it's important both from a performance and a risk of injury point of view. And of course, every force that the hoof creates has to be counteracted from the ground. So this is really what we started out doing with this machine that you have seen and which Mick started using on racetracks many years ago. The important thing is, of course, that this mechanical machine really mimics a horse cantering or actually jumping, landing after a jump on a track. It can be tuned for representing different horses. Anyway, it's really important to understand that you need to measure like it would be a horse. If you want to be a horse, a mosquito can't measure a surface for an elephant. That is the very image of what you should think of. And it's not only about load, it's load rates, and it's the speed, and it's the angle that the hoof lands that we are trying to mimic with this machine. So this has been used extensively both in racetracks, but also in many equestrian arenas today. One of the first things we started working with when we went into equestrian arenas was really to define not scientific or engineering terms. Of course, we would measure things in kilonewtons and in Gs and so on, but we want to use terms that are relevant for the equestrian and or I would say the whole equine world. And what we came up with was that we need to have 5 different functional properties, and I will go into these in more details, but it's impact firmness, it's cushioning, responsiveness, grip, and uniformity. So starting with impact firmness, now we go back to the biomechanics of hoof-ground interaction. Impact firmness is really when the hoof lands, so not a big mass, small mass, as I told you before. So from a surface point of view, this is really important with the very, very, very top layer. I'm talking about centimeters. Of course, it's a little bit dependent on how soft it is, what is actually impact firmness. But it's really the first contact with a low mass. And again, we could look at it like this. So just as the hoof land, and at the same time, we do have the landing of this mechanical hoof. I mean, the use of the mechanical hoof is because we really need a standardized method to be able to use literally all over the world. And as you understand, it could be quite difficult to take one horse all around all tracks and arenas around the whole world. So it's better with a mechanical horse. It's also much better repeatability, even though it doesn't represent all horses, but some kind of an average of horses. So this is impact firmness. Cushioning is directly related to the maximum load, and the maximum load is when the limb is vertical like this. And of course, you realize if you have the very small hoof actually, or even just the rim of the hoof, and you load that with more than 1,000 kilos, that pressure will really penetrate into much deeper layer. This is one of the crucial things for creating, because it's not really easy to feel how the ground reacts, especially to this kind of force, unless you're a horse or you actually have a testing device specifically measured for this. So again, this is interesting because it can go down. There are some examples of putting sensors in different depths of turf, and they showed that they were able to measure the force of the impact 40 centimeters below the surface. So it's really, really deep. And again, it's interesting to discuss turf because turf has these roots, and if you have a deep root system, you are really able to create some kind of dampening properties, some kind of elasticity, which we will also talk about in deeper layers. And that is really important to make it possible to dampen these high forces. We're going to talk more about cushioning. So maximum load when the limb is in full load, and also when the whole mechanical hoof is fully compressed. And then there is a load cell here measuring that. So it's actually think of a scale that measuring continuously. Here, when it came to the impact, it was an accelerometer who was measuring the data actually, but we translate into the parameters: impact firmness, cushioning, and the next was then responsiveness. So responsiveness is, of course, related to elasticity, but we are not looking at how much energy return you get from the ground, because you cannot really tune the elasticity so it fits all horses. It needs to be tuned so it not rebounds before the horse is actually getting off the ground, because if it starts to rebound before the horse really had reached its maximum load, then the surface will be perceived as very, very hard by the surface. So what we are measuring here is actually the timing of the rebound from the ground, and that it doesn't come too fast, because then some horses will perceive the surface as hard, and of course the loads will also increase in that case. So that's responsiveness. This was a very special kind of surface where there's actually rubber underneath it, and I chose it just for the video to really see this elasticity. The good thing with elasticity generally in the ground is, of course, that it retains its properties. So the next horse coming over it will have the same kind of surface as opposed to a surface that compacts, for example. So next thing is grip. I think you all heard about grip, the importance of grip and how that can affect the loading on the horse. So the way we measure this is really looking at, of course, grip is important both for turns, for takeoffs, in each strides, in jumping and so on, and landing, of course. And what we really want is an adequate grip, because we don't want too much that increases the forces, as you have heard before, and too much risks start to get risk for the horse slipping instead. And what we can do with the mechanical hoof is, as you can see, there is an angle between how it falls down and how it's actually landing here. So you see it moves a little bit forward, and this force cell that sits here can also measure horizontal forces. So that's why we are able to quantify the grip in a way that is relevant for the horse. And finally, uniformity is very important. So we have all the four previous parameters are uniform over the surface, or over the whole arena, or the whole race course. Of course, I'm not saying that horse can't cope with variance, but the problem is if you don't see this variance, then it gets really risky. So if it, without being able to see something, it's all of a sudden gets looser, less grip, or very hard, then you increase the risk of injury dramatically. So then comes the next thing: what is good or bad? And this is really difficult. I mean, it's back to the epidemiology, and what we really need to do is to create new epidemiology based on correlating risk of injuries to these measurements. What we started out doing in equestrian sports was making a survey where we had a large number of riders answering evaluation. So we had more than 300 top riders evaluating more than 600 arenas, or sorry, 600 arena evaluations. It wasn't more than 10 arenas, with a fairly good response rate. The interesting thing was that based on this, we can, in show jumping, and specifically in show jumping now, give you an idea about what top professional riders think. The survey looked like this. So they didn't have to say whether it was good or bad. They just evaluated, for example, impact firmness as soft or hard in comparison to a majority of other arenas, and so on. And at the end, they made an overall rating. And that enabled us to do a correlation between the OBST measurements and the subjective evaluation. And the important thing is, when you sort them like you do here, you can see that there is a very, very good correlation, the two lines between subjective evaluation and objective measurements. But if you look at single arenas, you can see it's quite big, could be quite big difference between the red and the blue. So the simple interpretation of this is that we do measure something that is perceived by riders, by top riders, but asking a single rider, you get very, very different opinions. And I don't think this comes as a surprise. The interesting thing is that it looks the same for all the 5 parameters. The curve, it's a little bit flatter when it comes to responsiveness, meaning that the correlation is not as strong, or it's not so much variation. So this data that we measure can then be presented over an area like this, or it can be presented like an area map like this. But based on the combination of the survey and the measurements, I think this is a simpler way to understand it. So bringing out just one single measure, in this case, the cushioning, we can see in this case, it was actually from the World Equestrian Games in Tryon a couple of years ago. And we followed, that was a temporary arena, fiber sand arena that was put in. Over time, you see from Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, we can see how it compacted more and more compacted. So getting from within a green area all the time, that is what is seen as a good, acceptable, but it's going from a deeper surface to a more compact surface. And this is, of course, something we would see also in turfs, depending on especially weather conditioning, whether the moisture content, where it's aerated, or other maintenance procedures. So I'm going to give you another couple of examples. So let's compare 2 very different surfaces and just look at it. So this is from a sand, or I would say more like gravel actually, and look at the hoof here, how it lands, get to a very quick vertical stop, but it actually allows to slip here. So the grip is not too high, but the cushioning would be very high on this surface. So we have not exactly the same horses, but the same category of horses working on turf. And I think this is also very interesting. Look at how this horse, when it lands, it's the same leading front limb in canter. So it should be comparable. I don't go into the graphics too much here, but what we see is actually horizontal and vertical speed of the hoof. But what we see here, what I really think is interesting, you see the first impact, and then when the load from the horse comes, you can see how the hoof is actually pushed into the ground. And this, of course, creates some lowering of the cushioning, actually dampening of the maximal load. So in this case, you could say that it's very nice with the turf. If you want to discuss more details, you can see in this case it's a horse with studs, And you can actually see how it actually breaks the horizontal. The grip is, thanks to the grips, quite high in this case. So again, just comparing different surfaces, Thoroughbred on a synthetic surface, you see it's deep, it goes into the ground quite extensively. And again, just make comparison, look at trotters, in this case with bare feet trotters, but look how very much the hoof is actually sliding on that. And I'm sure you're aware of trotting racetracks. They are really compacted, but having a surface that allows the hoof to slide uses the built-in dampening mechanism of the horse when it actually is allowed to have a bit of slide when it lands. So let's finish with some specifics. Turf, I think this was an interesting graph I brought up here. In this case, it was a training turf. This training turf had an old road underneath. And look at the cushioning, especially the cushioning here, what a huge difference there is. This is exactly the same turf, it's just two different places. And this is from an equestrian turf competition, and it's on the same level. So you see very much in the green area. This is a fiber sand arena that was tested on the same day. And when the owner saw this result in cushioning, they did some thorough maintenance of that fiber sand arena. And you see a week later, they were able to have it to look like that. But the interesting thing is, look at how the impact firmness really made a low dip. So it's really difficult it's really difficult many times to construct and maintain a fiber sand arena in a way that it actually resembles the turf. So in my experience, and I think this is of course supported by evolution as well, a good turf, because the turf can change a lot too, of course, as we can see here. But a really good turf is kind of the baseline or the gold standard for a good turf, and that is really what many people working with fiber sands in equestrian sports is to mimic good turfs. So this was just a small example. It wasn't very much difference in the responsiveness and grip in this case, so I don't go into more details. So of course, the final question is, what is the perfect surface for a horse? Well, I can give you the secret answer to this. Thank you very much.
This is Karen, and this is her land. She's been here a long time, along with Mojo. The first fence post went up here. Now there's 5,000 of them. After the storm, she started the cleanup here. And when she needs some peace and quiet, she always finds it right here. This is more than just land, it's home. Karen runs with us on a John Deere 3E Series tractor, because who says a day's work has to take all day? Nothing runs like a Deere. Search John Deere 3E Series for more.
Being a teenager and in high school and middle school is not easy for girls these days. And they get to come here, spend time working around the farm, spend time with the animals, and not feel that pressure until we go to horse shows. The first time I saw this land, I was about 12 years old. I came here with an old mentor. I fell in love with it as a little girl, and I said I was gonna own it one day. My mother, when I was 4 years old, put me on a little pony walking around the zoo. That was it for me. Love at first sight. Like any kid, when I was younger, I wanted to compete more in the Olympics and go Grand Prix and do things like that. But I put that all on the side and realized I had a different agenda in life. I've taught about 800 kids in this area. A typical day starts early in the morning with feeding the horses. Then usually we clean stalls. This is a daily chore, sometimes twice a day. I'm always on the tractor, mowing, spreading things around, you name it. This is a John Deere 3025P. I love my tractor. I couldn't live without it. I like to just relax and be left alone. I call it my husband. He's very reliable, and it doesn't argue. It's so easy to use. My 68-year-old mother has never driven anything like this before, and she was scared to death of it. And once she did, she loves it. She drives it all the time for me and helps me out around the farm. Being here in Florida, we deal with a lot of hurricanes, so it can be very stressful when we're in the path of one. That John Deere helps me so much. We go around picking up debris, moving, pushing things with the bucket. I always have an average of 50 students, so whenever there's a disaster that comes around, they're always here and they're ready to work. I call all my girls my kids. They're like part of my family, and they get scholarships for riding, and so we try to keep our sport here a little bit serious but fun. We go to the horse shows. It's great for them. Good, very nice. Teaches them a lot of sportsmanship, how to be more in charge and have more self-confidence. A little stronger on that. There. The parents tell me all the time, you are such a huge influence in our child's life. I love to share my experience with these girls and be able to steer them in a better path. Everybody always asks me, how do you keep doing this? I say, just the sheer passion of it. What am I gonna do? Get a condo on the beach somewhere? I'm happier here. I'm Karen Neese, and this is my land.